It was a warm morning in St. Petersburg, Florida, July 2nd, 1951. A landlady named Pansy Carpenter walked down the hall of her apartment building. She had a telegram for one of her tenants, a 67-year-old widow named Mary Reeser. Miss Carpenter knocked on the door to apartment 4. No answer. She tried the doorknob. Not just warm, but hot to the touch. That was strange and alarming. Worried, she went to get help from 2 painters working nearby. One of them, a man named Richard Bruce, put his hand on the door. He jerked it back. It was definitely too hot. They forced the door open. What they saw inside didn't make sense. It still doesn't for a lot of people. The room was filled with a thick, greasy soot. The air was heavy and smelled of smoke, but there were no flames, no signs of a major fire. In one corner of the room sat the charred remains of an overstuffed armchair, and in those remains a small pile of gray ash. On top of that pile of ash was a human skull. It had been shrunk by intense heat to the size of a teacup. Nearby, police would find a few calcified fragments of vertebrae, and sticking out from the ashes, almost untouched, was a single human foot, still wearing a black satin slipper. That was all that was left of Mary Reeser. Her entire body, which weighed around 175 pounds, had been reduced to about 10 pounds of ash, a shrunken skull, and one perfect foot. The rest of the apartment was barely damaged. A stack of newspapers just a few feet from the chair was unsinged. A mirror on the wall nearby was cracked from the heat, and some plastic objects had melted. There was soot high on the walls and ceiling, but the carpet wasn't burned through. The electrical outlets worked. The fire, whatever it was, had been incredibly intense, but also incredibly contained. It had consumed a human being almost completely, yet it hadn't bothered to spread. The St. Petersburg police chief, J.R. Reichert, was baffled. He sent a box of the evidence to the FBI. He included carpet samples, bits of the chair, the bone fragments, and the single surviving slip. He wrote a note to J. Edgar Hoover. He said it was one of the strangest things he had ever seen. The FBI report eventually came back. They found no evidence of any accelerants. No gasoline, no kerosene, nothing that would explain such a destructive fire. They couldn't determine the cause. The official verdict was that Mary Reeser had fallen asleep while smoking a cigarette, which ignited her flammable rayon nightgown. A simple, tragic accident. But for many, that explanation felt thin. How could a cigarette fire generate the 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit needed to cremate a human body to that extent? A crematorium takes hours at extremely high, controlled temperatures to do that job. And how could a fire that hot fail to burn down the entire apartment building? This is where the other theory comes in. A theory that is ancient, terrifying, and compelling. The theory is called spontaneous human combustion. And the case of Mary Reeser, often called the Cinder Lady, is its most famous example. So, did spontaneous human combustion kill Mary Reeser? To answer that, we have to understand what people mean when they say it. Spontaneous human combustion, or SHC, is the idea that a human body can, without any apparent external source of ignition, burst into flames from within. The fire is said to be incredibly hot, consuming the torso and organs completely, but often leaving the extremities, like hands or feet, intact. And just like in Mary Reeser's apartment, the fire supposedly does little to no damage to the victim's surroundings. This isn't a new idea. Stories of people mysteriously burning up have been around for centuries. In the 17th century, a Danish physician documented a case in Italy where a man was said to have vomited fire and then turned to ash. Charles Dickens even used it in his novel Bleak House, where a character named Crook dies from what he calls spontaneous combustion, leaving behind only a greasy soot and a terrible smell. At the time, many people believed this was a real phenomenon, often linked to alcoholism. The thinking was that a body saturated with alcohol became highly flammable. Proponents of the SHC theory look at the Mary Reeser case and see a textbook example. They see a body almost completely destroyed by a fire of unimaginable heat. They see that fire confined to an impossibly small area. They see the unburnt newspapers and the intact carpet as proof that this was no normal fire. They see the shrunken skull and the single preserved foot as classic calling cards of SHC. They ask a simple question: if it wasn't SHC, then what was it? A cigarette, they argue, simply can't do that. A lit cigarette burns at around 700 degrees Fahrenheit when being puffed, and much cooler when sitting in an ashtray. To cremate bone requires temperatures well over 1,500 degrees, and to do it so thoroughly suggests even more heat. A house fire can reach those temperatures, but it doesn't stay in one corner. A house fire spreads, it consumes everything. This fire didn't. It was a sniper, not a bomb. The local fire chief at the time, L.C. Peck, agreed that he'd never seen anything like it. The police chief was stumped. Even a physical anthropologist named Wilton Krogman, who was consulted on the case, was initially mystified. He was a leading expert on fire and its effects on the human body. He reportedly said he found it hard to believe a human body could be so completely consumed with so little damage to the room. He pointed to the shrunken skull as something particularly bizarre. He said he had seen skulls shrink in intense heat before, but never to this degree. His confusion and his expert opinion are often used as powerful evidence by those who believe in SHC. They say, if the experts were baffled, it must be something beyond our normal understanding of science. The SHC theory also tries to explain the spontaneous part, the internal ignition. Over the years, believers have proposed various mechanisms. Some have suggested that a buildup of methane in the intestines could somehow be ignited. Others have talked about static electricity building up in the body and discharging catastrophically. One writer, Larry Arnold, even proposed a new subatomic particle he called a pyrotron that he claimed could pass through the body and trigger a nuclear-level chain reaction. These explanations sound scientific, but they don't hold up. The amount of methane in the human gut is tiny, not nearly enough to fuel such a fire. A static shock might be unpleasant, but it can't cremate a person. And the pyrotron is pure fiction, an idea invented to fit a conclusion. There is no known biological process by which a human body can generate the temperatures needed to ignite itself. The human body is, after all, about 70% water. We are not easily flammable. This is the central problem with the SHC theory. It describes a set of strange circumstances very well, but it fails to provide a plausible cause. It relies on mystery and the unknown. But there is another explanation. An explanation that is far less paranormal, but perhaps even more unsettling. It's called the wick effect. And this is where the simple official explanation of a dropped cigarette starts to make a lot more sense. The wick effect is a simple concept that most of us see all the time. Think of a candle. A candle is a block of wax with a string, the wick, running through it. If you try to light the block of wax directly with a match, it will just melt a little. It won't catch fire. But if you light the wick, something different happens. The flame on the wick melts the wax near it. The liquid wax is then drawn up the wick by capillary action. This wax, now a vaporized fuel, is what burns. The candle creates a small, self-sustaining fire that slowly consumes its fuel source over a long period. Now, apply this to a human being. The human body contains a lot of fat. This body fat is the wax. The person's clothing, especially natural fibers like cotton, is the wick. All you need is an external ignition source. Let's reconstruct the night Mary Reeser died. She told her son, Dr. Richard Reeser Jr., that she had taken 2 Seconal sleeping pills. She was planning to take 2 more before bed. She was a heavy smoker. She was last seen sitting in her comfortable, overstuffed armchair, wearing a flammable rayon nightgown. So, imagine this scenario. Mary Reeser, drowsy from the sleeping pills, dozes off in her chair. The lit cigarette in her hand falls onto her nightgown. The nightgown starts to smolder. This is the external ignition. The fire is small at first, but it's enough to burn through her skin and reach the layer of subcutaneous fat beneath. Once the fat is exposed to the heat, it begins to melt. The liquid fat soaks into her nightgown, just like wax soaking into a candle's wick. The nightgown, now saturated with fuel, begins to burn more intensely, but slowly. Her body has become a candle. An inside-out candle where the fuel is on the inside and the wick is on the outside. This process is not a raging inferno, it's a slow, smoldering burn. It could have gone on for hours. This slow, persistent fire generates a steady, intense heat. Because the fuel source is Mary's own body fat, the fire stays localized right where she is sitting. It doesn't need to spread to find more fuel. The chair she was sitting in, likely made with cotton stuffing and wood, would also have acted as fuel, contributing to the fire. The wick effect explains all the bizarre details of the scene. It explains the near total destruction of her body. A slow fire burning for 5, 6, or even 7 hours can absolutely generate enough sustained heat to calcify bones. Crematoriums use very high heat for a shorter time. The wick effect is a lower heat for a much longer time. The end result can be very similar. It explains the lack of damage to the rest of the room. The fire was contained to its fuel source, Mary in her chair. It didn't need to spread to the newspapers or the curtains because it had plenty of fuel right where it was. It wasn't an explosive, out-of-control house fire. It was a focused, patient fire. It explains the greasy soot on the walls. Burning human fat produces a thick, oily, black smoke. The smoke would have risen to the ceiling and coated the upper parts of the walls, exactly as was found in her apartment. It explains the shrunken skull. This is a known, though rare, phenomenon. Under prolonged, intense heat, bone can lose its organic matter and collagen, and the mineral structure can shrink and warp. Dr. Krogman's initial surprise is understandable, as it's not something seen every day, but it is not scientifically impossible. It's a direct result of a body being cooked at a steady temperature for a very long time. And it explains the leftover foot. This is one of the most common features in suspected SHC cases. The extremities, like hands and feet, have less body fat than the torso. The fire, consuming the fat-rich core of the body, may have simply run out of fuel before it could fully consume the foot. Or perhaps the way her leg was positioned, with the slipper on, protected it just enough from the flames. It was simply the last part. The fire got to, and the fire extinguished itself, perhaps due to lack of oxygen in the sealed room, before the job was done. The science behind the wick effect isn't just a theory. It has been demonstrated. In the late 1990s, a forensic scientist named Dr. John DeHaan conducted an experiment for a BBC television program. He took a dead pig, which has a fat-to-muscle ratio similar to a human's, wrapped it in a blanket, placed it on a wooden structure in a furnished room, and lit the blanket with a small amount of gasoline, simulating a drop match or cigarette on flammable clothing. The pig smoldered for over 5 hours. The fire was quiet and contained. When it was over, the majority of the pig's torso and bones had been turned to ash. The fire had generated intense heat, enough to crack a nearby television screen, but it had not spread to the rest of the room. The carpet underneath the pig was not even burned through. The scene looked remarkably similar to Mary Reeser's apartment. He had successfully replicated the conditions of a so-called spontaneous human combustion case using a simple scientific principle. So when we put the two theories side by side, the picture becomes much clearer. On one side, we have spontaneous human combustion. This theory requires us to believe in an unknown, unproven biological mechanism that can cause a human body to ignite itself. It offers no plausible cause, only a description of a mysterious effect. It relies on the idea that the scene is too strange to be explained by normal science. On the other side, we have the wick effect. This theory requires only a simple, common ignition source, like a cigarette. It uses a well-understood principle of combustion, the same one that makes a candle work. It successfully explains every single piece of bizarre evidence found at the scene, the completeness of the destruction, the localized nature of the fire, the greasy soot, the shrunken skull, and the leftover limb. It accounts for all the facts without needing to invent new laws of physics. The principle of Occam's razor says that when you have two competing explanations, the simpler one is usually the correct one, the one that requires the fewest new assumptions. A dropped cigarette from a woman who had taken sleeping pills, leading to a slow, smoldering fire fueled by her own body fat, is a tragic but fundamentally simple explanation. It is far simpler than assuming the existence of mysterious internal ignition forces that have never been observed or proven. So, why does the mystery of Mary Reeser persist? Why do people still want to believe in spontaneous human combustion? Part of it is the story. The Cinder Lady is a fantastic macabre tale. It's the kind of story you tell around a campfire. It's a modern gothic horror story that happens to be true. The image of a woman reduced to a pile of ash and a single slippered foot is powerfully strange. It's more interesting, more exciting than the sad, mundane reality of an elderly woman falling asleep with a lit cigarette. We are drawn to mystery, we are drawn to things we can't easily explain. The initial confusion of the investigators also fueled the legend. When the police chief and the fire chief say they've never seen anything like it, that carries weight. When an expert like Dr. Krogman expresses bafflement, it becomes part of the myth. But it's important to remember that this happened in 1951. Forensic science was not what it is today. The wick effect was not a widely known or understood concept among local law enforcement. Their confusion was genuine, but it wasn't proof of the paranormal. It was simply the limit of their knowledge at the time. In the end, the evidence against spontaneous human combustion is overwhelming. Not only is there a perfectly good scientific explanation for what happened to Mary Reeser, but there has never been a single documented case of SHC that has stood up to scrutiny. Every single classic case, when investigated thoroughly, reveals a plausible external ignition source nearby. The victims are almost always elderly, infirm, or intoxicated. They are often smokers. They are almost always alone, and near a source of flame, be it a candle, a fireplace, or a cigarette. The fire goes unnoticed for a long time, giving the slow wick effect hours to do its devastating work. Did spontaneous human combustion kill Mary Reeser? The answer is almost certainly no. Mary Reeser died in a fire. A strange and unusually destructive fire, but a fire nonetheless. It was likely started by her own cigarette. It was fueled by her own body and the chair she sat in. It was a horrific and deeply tragic accident. The story endures not because the science is mysterious, but because human nature is drawn to a good mystery. It's a chilling reminder of the strange things that can happen in the world. But the explanation isn't found in the supernatural. It's found in the simple, slow, and terrible chemistry of a candle. Mary Reeser didn't spontaneously combust. She became a human candle. And that reality, in its own quiet way, is just as horrifying as any paranormal explanation. It's a tragedy, not a phenomenon. A sad end to a life, not a supernatural event. The Cinder Lady Mystery is less a mystery about fire, and more a story about how we sometimes prefer a fantastical tale to a grim and simple truth.